Hello everyone, let me introduce myself. I am Facundo Carballo, and today I will explain you all about select statements in Golang. Since why it's recommended to use select statements, in which cases we have to use it, and how to implement a select statement in Golang programs. So now on the screen you are seeing a GitHub repo. I remind you that you will have the link of this GitHub repo on the description of the video. In this repo you will have all the code that you will see on this video. So I recommend you that you have it close to you while you are seeing this video, because it will help you to understand better those things. So first of all, how to implement channels. I want to tell you something before I forget. If you like this kind of videos, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel, because that helps me a lot to grow up on YouTube. So please, it's just a like and a subscribe button. Hit it. Well, here we have an example. This example is the same example that you will see on the GitHub repo. Well, to implement select statement, why we have the need to implement a select statement to synchronize Goroutines. Well, here in this example, we have three channels. First, look this diagram to understand better this situation. We have three channels. Our program reads data through these three channels: a channel of integers, a channel of floats, and another channel of strings. So our program can read an integer, floats, or a string and do something with that data. Okay, so if our program receives an integer, well, our program will have to do something. If our program receives a float, okay, our program will have to do something else. And the same logic for the strings. Okay, so we have three channels and we have to be listened of these three channels. If in this case we decide to don't use a select statement, we will have to create three Goroutines specifically to listen every channel. One Goroutine to listen the channel of integers, another Goroutine to listen the channel of floats, and other Goroutine to listen the channel of strings. And every time that a channel gets data from that channel, this channel will have to communicate to the main process and notify that, okay, this main process have to execute something with that data. But like we want to execute while we receive data, we will have to apply another synchronization mechanisms like mutex or something like that to synchronize. Okay, this came first, I have to do this first, and later when finished with that task I have to do the following, and so on. So it's a lot of logic for not implemented a simple select statement in this particular case. So with a select statement, it will look something like this. We have three channels a channel of integers, the float, and strings. There will be some Goroutines that will dedicate to put data through those channels. For example, a Goroutine that puts some integers here, another Goroutine that puts floats numbers here, and other Goroutine that puts strings to this channel. But we will have just one Goroutine to listen for all the channels. And the first data that comes from any of those channels, we will handle that and do whatever that we want to do with that data. For example, if I receive an integer, I want to multiply the integer by 2 and then print on the console, for example. And if I receive a float, I want to divide that float number to 5 and then print that number on the console. And if I receive a string, well, I just want to print that string on the console. It's just an example, but there is different functions to execute for every data type that we receive. So here, this Goroutine will listen to all of those channels, and the first data that comes to that select statement, because this will be a select statement that will listen for all of those channels, well, will execute the logic of that particular data type or that particular channel, because here we are saying that, okay, this channel is for integers, this other channel is for floats, but maybe there are two channels dedicated for integers, but for example, a channel is for ages and other channel is for prices, and both channels contains integers, but those channels have different meaning. So it's the same. The point is that every channel will have a case in the select statement. So if we receive data through that particular channel, the select statement will handle that and will execute the functions associated with that particular data type that we receive, and will handle that in a very easy way. So now we will see this particular case on code. So here we have these three channels: the channel of integers, the channel of floats, and the channel of strings. And well, we have here two functions. One to execute producers. These producers are three Goroutines that will produce integers every 3 seconds, floats every 3 seconds, and strings every 3 seconds. Here are the functions. This will produce a random integer and put that random integer to the channel using these sentences. Here we produce a random float and then put that float to the channel of floats that we receive here as a parameter, and then wait for 3 seconds. And well, the string it's more complex, but we generate a random integer from 0 to 100 and we convert that number to a string, and then we get the bytes of that string, and well, with the bytes we get the hash of that particular string, and we put that hash to the channel of strings. And well, that's all for the producers. The producers are just three Goroutines that will never end because there is a for loop every time in each producer function, but with a wait time of 3 seconds in each one. So that for the producers. But the consumers, when we execute the consumers, well, here we have the select statement because this is the consumer here. So the consumer obviously have a for loop, but I will explain that later. But the main important thing is here in the select statement. In every case, we create a variable called data, that this variable will contain the data from a channel. Can be from the channel of integers, can be from the channel of floats, and can be from the channel of strings. So the select statement here is telling us, okay, if I receive for any reason, I've received an integer from this channel, I will put that integer on this variable data and will execute all the functions that have this case. If we have here more than one function, okay, we'll execute more than one function. We'll execute all the functions that we put here. But for this case, we just have one function to execute when we receive an integer. The same for the float. So if for any reasons this channel receive a float, the select statement will create a variable called data and will put here the float that we get from the channel. The same for the string. We'll create a variable called data with the string that we get from the channel. But while we are not getting any data from any of those three channels, the select statement will be blocked until some of these three channels can get some data. So be careful with that, because maybe can produce a deadlock. Because if there is no other Goroutines or something that put data to any of those three channels, there is a deadlock, because this will never execute and will be blocked forever. And why we put here a for loop, a for end loop, because this for loop will never end? It's because we want to be listening every time, always, for new data that comes to these three channels. Because the select statement will listen for the first data that comes to these channels. So these channels doesn't have data. This other channel also doesn't have data, and the string channel doesn't have data. Okay, the select statement will be waiting for the first data that comes. And for example, if comes a float, the select statement will execute and will finish. So to be listening again, to be waiting again for some new data, I aggregate this for loop, because every time that the select statement executes, then we'll execute again because of the for loop. And the functions that we use here is just for this particular case to show an example, but can be more complex functions where we receive an integer and we, for example, have to buy something or have to do something more complex than just print the number on the console. But for this purpose of the video, I just decided to print this with this particular signature to identify which function is. In this case, well, print integer, print float, and print string. So we can identify on the console, okay, there is executing this function because the select statement received that particular string or that particular float or integer. So now I will execute this select function to see what happens on the console. And well, here we have the first data printed by the consumers. The producer of integer produced 52, the producer of strings produced this hash, and the producer of floats produced this float. 27 with 69. We can execute this again to see all the data all the data printed by the consumer, but there's a lot of data. Every 3 seconds will be printed again and again and again, new data. And you can see that not every time we get the same order of consumers executing. And that's because we lost the control of our programs. We cannot decide now when the producer will produce something. That's because we are working with concurrency, with Goroutines, but maybe the producer of integers produce an integer and then wait for 3 seconds, and then the producer of floats produce another float, and then instead of execute the producer of strings, it's executed the producer of integers again, and so on. We lost the control of our program, so that's because we have to use synchronization mechanisms when we apply concurrency, not only in Golang, in all the others programming languages. Every time that we work with concurrency, we have to apply synchronization mechanisms to make our programs work properly. And well, that's all for this video. I hope that you could understand why, when, and how to use select statements in Golang. I will ask you again, if you like this kind of videos, hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. It's so simple. Subscribe to my channel. See you on the next video.